if you want to help somebody, you need to know first with the problem the person is living, and then you need to discover the realities.
That's a feeling shared by many living in Burkina Faso, Mali, or Niger. People who believe that EU relations with Sahel countries bring little benefit to their everyday lives.
But the EU says it's turning the page with a renewed strategy for engaging the Sahel. The question is, how different is this new approach?
I don't arrive in Bamako or Ouagadougou or Niamey with demands saying you have to do this or you have to do that. What I do arrive with is the availability to listen.
Listening is indeed a critical step towards understanding people's concerns, right? But are these military-led nations ready for the EU's renewed diplomatic push?
That's a great question. And how will the EU balance its interests with those of these military regimes?
There are some things we just have to agree to disagree. We're not going to come to an agreement. However, that doesn't mean that we have to be paralyzed and not talk about anything else.
The protection of human rights and enforcement of security are some of the core parts of this new approach to the Sahel.
And that's exactly what we will be interrogating in today's show. Ready?
Yes, Judge.
Hello,
Hi.
and a very warm welcome. Hi, my name is George Okachi.
And I am Mimi Mefoneu. Welcome to Under the Baobab, where we make Africa's biggest issues personal.
Indeed, we make every issue personal, and every week we engage with those shaping conversations across the continent. And just recently, Mimi, most of our viewers have been asking us to tackle EU-Sahel relations, and it should be the other way around, Sahel-EU relations,
That's
right?
what you always say, but
Yes.
it's a perfect timing because the EU has just unveiled what it's called a renewed strategy for Sahel nations, and this is a very timely conversation.
But what exactly does this new strategy mean after a period of coup-driven tensions and a significant reduction in EU missions? The EU is now reasserting its presence with a renewed approach.
Yeah, you've talked about coup, and you know, from 2021, 2022, 2023, we've seen so many coups within Africa and just recently Guinea-Bissau. So this new approach actually focuses on keeping people safe, protecting their rights, and also talking honestly with the military governments in Niger, in Burkina Faso, in Mali. Instead of using force, the EU now wants to help with food, with health, and better leadership.
Indeed, and that's why our guest today, Mimi, is Joao Gomes Cravinho, and he is the EU Special Envoy to the Sahel. He is also Portugal's former Minister of Foreign Affairs.
So he was recently in Ghana to meet with President John Mahama due to the growing concerns that the insecurity in the Sahel is spilling into coastal states like Ghana, Togo, and also Cote d'Ivoire, also known as Ivory Coast.
Yes.
There's always a saying that if my neighbor's house is on fire, I should also be careful, George.
Yeah, and this is a major concern to people living along the coastal areas. We're talking about the fishermen who are there, the communities who depend, on economic activities around this area. And if there is a spillover of, these jihadist attacks and they're coming from majorly the Sahel nations down to the coastal nations, then it is a big problem. And that's why the conversation with Cravinho began with how do they, concretely say that they are supporting these nations to fight insecurity.
Right.
Clearly, there are linkages between organized crime that is coming from the coast, from ports, from the sea, and the jihadi movements in Central Sahel. And it is this linkage that is fundamental for all of us to be acting upon. This is a fundamental part of control over the coast of the Gulf of Guinea as a whole. All up the coast, there are important ports from here, from Tema to, of course, Abidjan, and further up we have Monrovia, we have Freetown. These ports can all link, and Lomé, Cotonou as well. These ports can all link to jihadi movements unless they are properly secured, unless they are properly controlled. This security begins at sea, but it also extends, of course, to land and to proper control over the port activities.
You've mentioned the Sahel Gulf of Guinea corridor, and it seems the EU is now prioritizing countries like Ghana, Benin, Togo, and Ivory Coast over military-led states like Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso. But how can we protect people in Gulf of Guinea nations from jihadist threats without partnering with those Sahel regimes, especially since most attacks originate there?
I think that a year, 2 years ago, a lot of analysts were saying, now we're going to see a push from the jihadi movements down to the coast. Actually, in the last year or two, we have not seen that. We have not seen any kind of territorial expansion of jihadi attacks down into the coast. There have been here or there some sporadic attacks, but nothing like what is happening in Mali, Burkina Faso.
But the sporadic jihadist attacks have a great toll on civilians in coastal nations like Ghana. And I'm sure Ghanaians watching would wish to know, what is the EU actually doing to help, especially since it wants to partner with their country on security?
What we need to be doing as European Union is working very closely with the state authorities. We have to do this always in close collaboration with the state authorities. We have no mandate to go into countries of West Africa and say what should be done and shouldn't be done. What we do have a mandate to do, and this mandate comes from our own citizens, is to work very closely with the legal, legitimate authorities of Ghana or of other countries in order to support them in their fight against this link between organized crime and the jihadi movements.
George, Africa has suffered a lot of coups d'etats over the past few years. It started but from 2021, 2022, and 2023 in a row.
It was unprecedented.
Yes, unprecedented, because we saw countries in the Sahel like Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger experiencing military coups. And after each of these military takeovers, people were expecting that, jihadist insurgencies and also violence and insecurity was going to come to an end. But it's far from being the reality in these countries. So the question is, why? And even before this military takeovers, this country were already experiencing a lot of security challenges.
Take it from a point of, people who are feeling the effect of this insecurity. And whereas they've been hearing big talk from, say, the EU or even their governments, giving them reassurances that, of course, such partnerships is going to help us fight against, rather push these jihadists and maybe contain them for some reason. But this is not happening. And that's why the EU now is sort of saying, we are coming with a different approach, a different strategy altogether. Yeah.
So I can't help but continue to question these strategies, because when you look at EU annual reports and even a report by the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, which is CIPRI, it actually indicates that when it comes to flow of arms across the world, including Africa, EU is the number one arms supplier on the continent, even though also reports indicated recently that the numbers have reduced. The number of arms that are being, transported or taken to Africa have reduced. But the illicit flow of arms remains a major issue in the continent, which is not controlled. And I would have loved the European Union to really focus on this, like putting an embargo on illicit flow of arms.
As you've rightfully said, without this illicit or flow of the illicit, arms, then you cripple the activities of these terrorists.
Right.
And what they are waging against the communities, along the Sahel and also to the coastal, the spillover effects to the coastal countries. So it's a very valid question. And how I wish that, this renewed strategy would also focus on this particular element that you've raised. So that was the question to Cravino. What is different about this new strategy, and how are they going to ensure that, the military and security partnership in some way, is geared towards helping the Sahelians, citizens?
When we engage in military and security cooperation with other countries, they need to have this assurance that there is proper training, that accompanies the delivery of equipment. So we work with the Ghanaian authorities, we work with authorities of other countries, and I think that on our side, working with Ghana has been very satisfactory because we're thinking eye to eye. We are thinking along the same lines about the importance of accountability, the importance of respect for human rights in the use of, with the use of military equipment.
And indeed, let me just interrupt. Ghana is positioning itself as a bridge between ECOWAS and Sahelian military regimes. So how is Accra helping EU behind the scenes to renew relations with junta-led countries, and what outcomes would make you say, yes, this kind of quiet diplomacy is delivering for ordinary citizens of Mali?
Well, by definition, quiet diplomacy should be a little bit quiet. So I will, but having said that, what I can say is the following, that we find that in those countries there is a desire to engage with us. And the work that we're doing at the moment with them is to try to see, because we don't share the same perspectives on many things. And we have to have the sufficient maturity. We and they have to have the sufficient maturity to say, you know, there are some things we just have to agree to disagree. We're not going to come to an agreement. However, that doesn't mean that we have to be paralyzed and not talk about anything else. We can engage in issue areas that are of common concern for both of us. We can work out what is the intersection between our interests and their interests and develop mechanisms of dialogue and cooperation that correspond to that intersection, even if there are other things that we just don't agree upon.
Yes, agreeing to disagree, and despite anti-West sentiments, the EU still wants to engage with Sahel nations, and they believe there is room for, improving relations.
Are people in Mali, Burkina Faso and Niger feeling that shift? And are they feeling and concerns about insecurity, livelihoods and youth unemployment finally being heard? Because the EU says it's listening, right?
Yes, and that's very critical, and that's the big question we pose to our followers, our community, and that's the beauty about the Under the Baobab. We really value the, feelings and the views of people on the ground. And our correspondent Fofana Makan in Bamako asked Malians what they think of EU's renewed approach.
UA can help us, but if only it can try to involves local communities. If those countries try to be together, it's something really good. It's something to be helped, okay? Because you cannot talk about development without peace.
If you want to help somebody, you need to know first the problem, the person is living, and then you need to discover the realities of those areas, what they are suffering from, and then you cannot just come and impose things on them and they will accept. No. AU has to see which one is better of all us. Okay? To Anglo balance all us in the world arm. As we talk about the Sahel countries, precisely in Mali. So to give us the priority first.
So these are people in Mali. Some months back, we saw them holding placards and saying that EU must go, France must go, and so on and so forth. So listening to them now, we can clearly hear from them that they want the EU to listen, truly listen to the challenges that are plaguing all their communities.
And I will tell you, people in Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger have supported the formation of an alliance of the Sahel states, and leaving ECOWAS and drawing closer to countries like Russia and Turkey,
China also.
And China.
Yes, they believe that countries like Russia better understands their needs and prefer working with them rather than the EU and the US. Yes, they would prefer to work with the EU and the Russia and China and Turkey, like you said, instead of the EU and the US. But we can't deny that the EU has contributed to some positive programs across the regions, especially supporting those civilians who need humanitarian aid, development fundings. We've also seen efforts geared towards ending jihadism, which was even there before we saw military regimes coming in and even after. So the challenge now is how these programs would actually survive and amid strained relations between the governments that is in the Sahel region.
Yeah, exactly. That's why I asked Cravino how the EU plans to keep supporting local people, even when political ties with their governments, are strained.
At the end of the day, it's because we are interested in what happens with ordinary people in Burkina Faso and Mali and Niger that we are engaged. We are concerned, we are talking about 75 million people in those three countries, and we cannot be indifferent to what happens to them, and we know that they face tremendous challenges. And therefore, what we are doing is shaping our cooperation in a manner that corresponds to their human security, because that is the dimension in which we can work. We're not working directly with the armed forces of those countries, but we can work with the civilian security forces. We can work also with human security in a wider sense, access to food, access to basic education, access to schooling. And on the other hand, also their socioeconomic resilience, their capacity for building up small businesses, generating employment, offering a future for their young people. And we know that the young people are the great majority of the population. So there are a number of areas in which we can work together, which are above all about creating better conditions of life and better opportunities, better future for the people of the countries, even if we don't agree on some aspects with the governments that they have.
So does this mean that you sometimes sit down with the juntas because the perception out there is that the EU is not welcomed in Mali, Niger, or even in Burkina Faso?
I have been to Mali and Burkina Faso and Niger and engaged in conversation with the country, with the people who are governing the country. And this is the way forward. I think that it is not possible for us to say we can make a difference, we can be supportive of the populations of those countries if we do not engage with those who are running the countries. That means, as I said, that we don't have to agree on everything. We just have to work out where we can correspond to our interests in a manner that is acceptable for all, and put the emphasis on that, while talking about the areas in which we do disagree.
And when you sit down with the military-led authorities, what are your non-negotiables so that European engagements doesn't become a photo opportunity with juntas but a shield for citizens' rights?
Well, what I would say the following. I don't arrive in Bamako or Ouagadougou or Niamey with demands saying you have to do this or you have to do that. What I do arrive with is the availability to listen, and also the availability to say, my friends, there are some impediments here for us in terms of working together. So let's see how we can go through those impediments. I want to arrive saying, let us try to work out what it is possible for us to do without, of course, compromising our values that are very important for us and for our populations.
When I heard Cravino saying that he doesn't just come and says, okay, you need to do this or you need to do that, I can't help but just wonder. Of course, the EU is coming with a renewed approach. It's a partnership and you cannot exist as an island. But these are also countries that the Sahel nations, it's already a bloc on its own that should be able to fight some of these problems like jihadism and so on.
Yes.
We also have ECOWAS in the same sub-region.
Yes.
And overall, we have the African Union. My question is, what have these existing blocs, organizations been able to do so that EU's efforts would just be like helping,
supportive,
fortifying, supportive? It seems like almost nothing is being done at the local level, I mean, in these countries that are affected by jihadism, by insecurity. And so we need the EU to come in and start from afresh.
I would say that the issue is that these entities are not listening to the people. If they were listening to what people are saying, then things would be different. If you assess, the trends and what is going on.
Yes.
But fundamentally, my question to Cravinho was, yes, you're renewing, approach. You want something different. So how different will it be this time round?
New approach has just been approved 2 weeks ago. So I think going forward over the next months, and I expect to be returning to Mali, Burkina Faso, Niger in January or February. Going forward, I think we will be able to give you some examples of that. But it's only been 2 weeks, so we're still in very early days.
Well, I hope you will consider getting real-time feedback from people in conflict-affected areas, beyond the meetings in the capital cities. But which new citizen-centered EU programs are you rolling out in your new approach?
We have, for example, at the moment, a package of around 150 million, which is there in order to develop projects that make sense. So these projects haven't been developed. This is money that is available, that we can say, we can use it if you want to make us interesting proposals, and if those proposals are ones that are compatible with the way that we believe that our money should be used. And so it is an opening that we are offering. And I think that there is interest, and why shouldn't there be interest on the side of the people who are running the countries in Mali, Burkina Faso.
Here under the baobab, when the conversation gets heated, there's a way that we lighten the mood, cool off things, and get to know our guests a little bit on a personal level. So who is Mr. Cravinho?
What was the most surprising thing you learned in your first months as EU envoy to the Sahel?
I think the most surprising thing was that it was sometimes easier to engage with the countries of the Sahel than to engage with our friends back in Europe. But we got over that.
One book, film, or song that shaped how you think about Africa or peace building?
I think it has to be The Long Walk to Freedom by Nelson Mandela.
A moment in the Sahel or West Africa that changed your mind about something important?
In Burkina Faso, understanding the importance for a group of women's cooperatives who are engaged in textile making, and understanding that sometimes some of the abstract theories that we seek to grapple with in our conversations in the capital really needed to be translated into very, very specific, concrete deliverables.
Now, if you were not a diplomat or a politician, what job would you have been doing?
I would like to return to academia, to be teaching. That gives me enormous enjoyment.
One habit you picked up from West Africans that you wish Europeans had?
Eating more jollof has to be part of it.
And how about a misconception about the Sahel you wish European citizens would drop?
It is very important for Europeans to understand that this is not about good guys and bad guys. This is about a very complex set of dynamics with wonderful people all around who are facing up to extremely difficult challenges.
Coffee with a village chief, a young activist, or a border police officer? And why?
At the end of the day, it has to be the young activist because, firstly, Africa is so young. This region is 70% of people under 25. They're the ones that we really need. They're the future. They're the ones that we really need to be engaging with and to understand. And their mentality is different from that of the older folks. And I'm one of the older folks. So that's the one that I need to be engaging with.
Now, the question Sahelian citizens ask you most often when the cameras are off.
Like some of the questions that you've been asking. What is the concrete changes that this is going to be making? And I think that this is something that we have to really be able to face up to.
One promise you make to yourself before each trip to the region.
I'm going to be in touch back home.
Indeed. So really what stood out for me during this interesting chat with Mr. Cravinho, I mean, getting to know him personally, was the jollof rice aspect.
Okay. People should eat jollof.
Yes, it's very delicious. So while the EU rethinks its approach, countries like Russia, China, Turkey, and the Gulf states are expanding their influence in the Sahel nations. Critics are saying that EU talks a lot about values, while others that we just mentioned are moving faster with financial incentives and security guarantees.
Actions, actions, actions. You mentioned talking a lot, but
Yeah.
less action probably.
Yeah.
But let's crunch the numbers here. China is investing in infrastructure projects like roads, government buildings, and stadiums. And tell you what, since 2013, Chinese companies have invested over $155 billion in Africa.
That's a lot. And Russia is also building armies and nuclear power plants. Trade remains under $20 billion. But Russia has concluded over 40 military cooperations pact with African nations under its Africa Core military contractor.
That's huge. And talk about Turkey. The Turkish businesses are expanding trade and investments in the continent, especially in agricultural machinery, electronics, processed foods, construction materials,
Right.
and defense technology. Bilateral trade surged from $5.4 billion in 2003
Yeah.
to over $40 billion by 2022,
2022,
right? With forecasts pushing towards $50 billion US dollars.
So the numbers are increasing as the years are going, and investments from all Gulf states will surpass 300 billion US dollars by 2026, which is next year in just few weeks. So if you compare China and EU's trade investments in Africa annually, the EU stands at 288 billion euros in 2022, and China is at $282 billion in the same year. These are a lot of numbers to deal with, but very factual and important.
Makiu, EU is a bloc, and these are countries you're talking about, which makes you wonder, how will the EU convince young people in the Sahel, I'm talking about Niger, Burkina Faso, and Mali,
Right.
to choose their partnerships from a villager's perspective or entrepreneur's perspective? What will make the EU's offer visibly different in the next few years?
Well, I certainly hope it is very different from the offer of Russia. And I think the one thing that everybody has understood is that Russia does not have solutions to offer. The situation in military situation is now much worse than when they first became engaged. Other countries, we don't require any kind of exclusivity. We believe that the range of instruments that we have at our disposal is incomparable to that of any other country or group of countries. But on the other hand, there is nothing against any of those countries, Burkina Faso, Mali, Niger, engaging with us at the same time as they engage with other countries. So we think that we don't underestimate our relevance. We don't underestimate our capacity, but we are not in the business of competing or crowding out.
Not in the
And-
business of competing or crowding out.
Right. So today's conversation has shown that Sahel's challenges can't be solved without trust. And trust begins with listening.
Listening. And exactly, the EU says it's ready to listen, but the real test will be whether people in Sahel actually feel the change in their daily lives. So you're talking about security, access to basic needs that they need.
Yes, which
ETC.
it's very, very important, Judge, because I asked myself,
Yeah.
I will say it again, if the guns, most of them are produced in Europe, why don't we have jihadism in Europe? It's because there is a level of control at the level of governments that would not allow jihadism to thrive. So what are the governments doing right and wrong in Africa? These are some of the questions that we have to be asking ourselves. So will the EU's new Sahel strategy finally turn dialogue into real action? We'll keep asking these questions only here under the baobab.
Exactly. And of course, if you want to join the conversation and share your thoughts, you're much welcome. This is a big family and a big community. Under the Baobab is available on our YouTube channel,
DW Africa, and also on Spotify, as well as Apple Podcasts.
And I'll be happy if you can give us and tell us what you want us to cover from your region. My name is George Okachi, and many thanks for listening and watching.
And my name is Mimi Mefo Neo. Is this the last time before the end of the year?
Definitely, this is the last time before the end of the year, but we
have
promise
a
you, we have a
surprise.
surprise for you. We are not going anywhere. We will be celebrating with you. We want you to be part of our conversation. And of course, we will be here to answer to your questions.
I'll miss you, George. I'll miss you. Till next year.
We are in spirit.
Yes, we are in spirit. Bye.